answer all these questions. And for that, let me invite my panelists. Please welcome to the stage Cassie Corsicroft, Chief Decision Scientist at Google. Mohammed Leela, CEO of Goodable. Cassie Cho, founder and editor-in-chief of Almost. Please. All right, guys, great to have you here with us. So since I'm the moderator, let me take the advantage of asking a question that I have been personally wondering for quite some time. How long before AI takes my job, Cassie?
Well, I actually don't think it's going to take your job. AI is about information. And let's consider the information that happened here. We know we were all emailed the questions beforehand, which you're probably going to take us off the road with, so buckle up. But presumably, there's a set of questions. We could have them projected on the screen, or everyone could get a little handout with the questions on it, and we would just go, question 1, I guess I'll take it, or do you want to take it, Cassie? And would that mean that you're not necessary? All the information's there? Absolutely not. This is going to be a social interaction that's going to be so much better because of the human stuff that we bring to it.
So I should not be worried?
I don't think you should be worried.
Are you worried? Because I know you're a journalist as well.
So I have a little bit of a different take on this. First of all, Jafar, you're very good at what you do. Nobody could replace you. Let's just acknowledge that for a second.
Oh.
AI is not going to take your job. But we managed to create a newsroom that has 2 journalists that can replicate the output of 20 journalists, and we did that through AI. So I think there are specific applications of AI that can dramatically increase the amount of content that we create. So in that sense, if I was a journalist that was doing 9-to-5 work and filing a story every day, I would be worried. And the reason why is right now the technology exists and it's such a level that I could train a machine learning platform or buy one off the shelf that learns how to speak the way that I do and learns how to write the way that I do. So I like to write in very long sentences, for example. My wife hates me for it. She's like, just get to the point. But I could train an AI model to write in exactly the same voice, the same style that I do. And therefore, I actually no longer have to write anything. I can just serve it prompts and say, hey, AI, can you write an article about the wildfires in Nova Scotia, for example, and write it in my voice? Now, it's not going to be perfect. The technology isn't where it's 100% convincing. But there are applications there where instead of a reporter writing 1 story a day, you can now create 10 stories a day, and the reporter's role changes from 1 to creating content to basically overseeing that content. So short answer to your question, no, it's not going to replace your job, but there are a bunch of other people whose jobs I think it will replace.
All right. I want to take your take on what he just said, but first I want to get your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what my fellow panelists have said. I don't think AI will fully replace our jobs as a fellow journalist. I think the human element is always going to be, journalists are always going to be needed to help us analyze the world and tell stories, and these are not things that AI can necessarily do. And we can use AI to help us to work more efficiently, so that we can produce more stories a day. But it still needs that human supervision to be able to really craft a beautiful story that's really going to move people with our emotions. And I think for example, when you can prompt the AI to say, oh, can you write a story about this? It's not coming up with the ideas. So we still need people to come up with these ideas to prompt the AI to help us to create content. So I think, it's about sort of working together with AI instead of, being scared of AI replacing us.
Mohammed is certainly concerned that it could happen in the near future. Now, a scientist here with us has just said that we should not be worried. But a journalist is worried. I wonder if you can convince him that he should not be worried based on data.
I didn't say don't worry. Let's just
for the
pause
record.
there. I said that the human element is important.
Okay.
And you spoke about what you do. In a moment, devaluing it as if there's no human element, we don't have to focus on we can forget the core bit that makes it important, right? Which is the human part.
Correct.
There is a whole lot of other stuff. A few thousand years ago, you would need clay tablets or papyrus. How would you get to writing? Someone would have to make that for you. Or you'd have to go figure out the papyrus yourself. You'd have to go make inks yourself. You wanted to be a painter, you would have to figure out how to create your own pigments. And the distance between your vision and the execution would just be spent on all this rather tedious stuff that there would be a whole economy around. Tools make that stuff better, faster, and it leaves the essential component for us to focus on. Those who are engaged specifically in things that a tool will enable. Let me start this again. A tool can make an individual much more efficient. Any tool that we accept, that we use, its purpose is to make us better. If you have a tool that actually makes you worse at whatever you do, you're not going to use that tool. So every time that we develop tools, that is to increase the productivity and efficiency of an individual. And traditionally, we tend to prefer the tool when there are parts of our job that we don't enjoy, we don't want to use. If your entire job is doing things for people that are kind of not creative, are very far removed from the idea, are rote, if there's a lot of that piece to your work, then you might want to consider moving a little bit closer to the creation and creativity side of things.
Okay, I'll come to you, but let me actually put this question to you. So tools make our lives easier, no doubt about that. But in order for me to be able to use a tool, I need to learn how to use it. But if I don't learn how to use a tool, does that perhaps indicate that AI is going to outpace me? If I choose, okay, I'm not learning this tool, I don't want to.
No, so I think that's a misconception, and I think the way that you're framing the understanding of the way AI works is slightly different. Sometimes AI is like a scary word, right? Like AI is robots and Terminator, and it's just going to destroy the world. Machine learning is a little bit easier for people to accept because really what you're doing is you're training algorithms and machine learning models to retrain themselves based on data sets that you provide. When you think of it that way, you understand how the efficiency is created. So I think that's a little bit easier. But going back to your previous point, can I indulge everybody in the audience? Can we do a small test?
Go for it.
So at Goodable, I mentioned that we've been able to replicate a large newsroom with very few people. We have an audio newscast that we do every day. We release it, I think, at 10 a.m. every morning, and it's just about the good things happening in the world. We took a random audio snippet of one of those newscasts, and I gave it to the tech team in the back. It's 20 seconds long, and I want them to play it, and then I'm going to ask the audience a question. Let's see if they can play it.
Okay, can we?
Welcome to Goodable Plus. I'm Dua, and we've got the world's most inspiring stories just for you. Coming up, archaeologists have found a 3,000-year-old artifact that's preserved so well it's still shining. Plus, scientists are using sound to bring coral reefs back to life, and results so far say it's working. But first...
So let me ask everybody in this audience a question. We have real people on our team, and we have people that are just avatars and not real. Raise your hand if you think that was a real person's voice. This was a random sample that we took.
Okay, I see 4 or... Okay.
Okay.
Let's say 10. 10 people have raised their hand.
No, well, there's more than that, but let's ask a different question. If you had that on your phone and you showed it to your parents or a sibling, and you said, hey, listen to this, do you think that they would say that that's a real voice? Now raise your hand if you think they would say that's a real voice. So that person, that voice doesn't exist. It's a voice that we trained off of one of our staff members. I think this touches on your point, where you have a tool that you can create that can recreate somebody's voice that's so realistic that I can have them say whatever I want them to say. So the original way that newsrooms worked was everybody would sit around in the morning and say, what are we going to cover today? And then they spend the rest of the day covering it.
Yeah.
We make that decision instantly. We create that script when we want to using AI, or we can even write it ourselves, and that voice is generated instantly. So now Dua, who's part of our staff, she used to be able to create 1 newscast a day. Now we can create 50. all from her voice. And that's what AI has allowed us to do.
So that involves risks, doesn't it? Because if anyone can replicate my voice, that means that it can be used for some illegal stuff as well. Kate, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think, first of all, to answer your question, it's about being sort of open to new technologies, right? The same way that we were sort of open to, social media, we were able to sort of move online. So, it's not necessarily being afraid of AI, but thinking about how it can, how we can use it to our advantages. But to go back to that point, I think it's really important, as journalists, for us to have to always go back to our standards, our ethical standards, because AI is not bound by the same standards, the ethical standards that we as journalists are. So it's not like necessarily we have to do a lot of changes. It's more just making sure that we apply these ethical standards to whenever we're using AI content. So, if we're, making, a story based on AI, generated by AI, or if we were having a reporter work on this story, what would we do as a news organization? We would, want to make sure that we're verifying our facts. We're checking that, nothing's made up, and, everything is cross-referenced, and we have a good standing. If, things were to come into question, we can say we've done our due diligence, we have done all that we can to verify that these facts are true. And so it's really important that, as journalists, if we are using these tools, that we continue to hold ourselves to the same standard that we would if we were, having, a reporter do it, checking. And then, if we are generating content, it's also important to be, transparent about our processes. I think a lot of news organizations are currently in the process of coming up with a strategy for AI and generating content. So, we've all seen the photo of, Pope Francis going viral for his puffer jacket. Everyone thought it was a real thing. But, if we are using, obviously generative AI has so much potential for us to especially smaller newsrooms that can't afford, huge wire subscriptions, we can, generate stock images. But if we're using it and it's pertinent for the viewer to know that, this is not a real thing that has happened, then we want to make sure that we're transparent about that. So we want to say, this is the same way that we would if we used a stock photo to be this is used for illustrative purposes only. We could say, this is generated by AI to, help illustrate the story because we don't have any photos, or we're trying to protect the identity of this person because they may come under attack.
I want to push back a little bit on the gray area here, because I feel like there's a false dichotomy that's been proposed. This concept of, on the one hand, you get this totally AI-generated voice, and we have to be so transparent about when that's happening. On the other hand, there's presumably human process. Yet we all know, and we know this because we've existed as citizens for a while, and you know this as professionals, I know this as a citizen, that what you get from the newsroom is not the actual human interview. What about all the cutting with software tools that have happened to splice, to take out the ums, to take out the pauses?
But to that, if I may, but you do see the actual human being on the output, don't you? As opposed to AI, you might see a completely, artificial person there, which we have in some cases.
Sure, yes, you can put an identity or responsibility behind it, and similarly, you could say whoever is the person from whom this voice came might be, called to take responsibility for some of these voice samples. There could be legal cases where a voice is used without permission, etc. What I'm pointing out, though, is that all the stuff in between, which is tool-assisted and technology-assisted, which is already not the natural thing as it was captured, is already all out there. And photoshopped images, that's another one, right? Where did you get the picture? What else was in the background? What's hidden? What's cropped? What's cut? What's adjusted?
Right.
There is so much software adjusting, and we are used to it. We don't take it that seriously anymore, the way that people several generations might have, when it was just so difficult to capture any image or any sound at all. So what I'm saying is that there is already a spectrum of technological assistance to take someone's original journalism and create the final product.
Okay, I want to broaden the discussion a little bit here, and I would like to respond to that, but let me go to Mohammed first. So Mohammed, lately we are seeing a lot of efforts by governments to regulate AI. If I'm not mistaken, about a few days ago, the European Parliament passed a regulation on AI. It took 2 years for the European Parliament to come up with the definition of AI. It took them 2 years to define what is AI. So this is what I think as a journalist. Technology is not bounded by boundaries, right? So what applies to the EU may not apply to the rest of the world. So how would you navigate through that?
So first of all, AI has been around for way longer than we've been talking about. If you've used YouTube in the early days, there was a recommendation algorithm. That's basically AI. That's a way to say we're taking this data that you gave us and we're giving you this experience through that data. Yeah. So AI has been around a very long time. What we talk about now is AI just sort of broke through a barrier recently where it's called generative AI, which can now generate new things from perceivably scratch. For us, it's Scratch, but really the people that design the models know it's not Scratch. It's just a massive data set that really captures, trillions and trillions of data points. And that's because the computing power that we have now has never been to this point where that computing power can now fit into your phone, right? That's the reality, is that most phones actually have AI processing units built in them. Now, here's the problem with regulation. So when I grew up, it was before Netflix, which means I'm ancient, I'm very old. I went to Blockbuster Video when I wanted to rent a movie, and I had to go and rent a DVD. And what happened was, if I didn't want to spend $5 or $10, whatever it was, on renting a DVD, I would ask one of my friends if they had a bootleg DVD that was copied from somewhere, and I didn't have to pay, and I could just watch it. So what did Hollywood do? Hollywood tried to regulate this by saying, we will make the selling of bootleg DVDs illegal. And so what did I do? Every time I went on a trip to the Middle East, I'd come back with a massive suitcase of DVDs because I knew exactly where to get them from. Then the industry said, well, let's introduce technology to make copying DVDs that have Hollywood watermarks and stuff illegal, and they did. And what happened? It went online. And if you remember, there was this whole BitTorrent craze, which is about maybe 15 years ago. Everybody was downloading Game of Thrones using BitTorrent websites because they didn't want to subscribe to HBO. So they tried to regulate the industry.
They still do, I mean.
They still do. Like, please do not go and download illegal things. There's that statement that
we do not encourage that.
We especially not Ertugrul, which we all love, right? Let's receive that from the right source. But they found a way around it. And so, look, I think the EU can try to regulate whatever they say AI is, but it's not going to work. It just won't. People will find a way around it. And we talk about ethics because we're journalists. So we say we shouldn't create things that are false. Well, what about people that don't have those ethics? And what about journalists who don't have those ethics? Now you're opening up a Pandora's box, and this goes back to your point, right, which is the way that we experience reality fundamentally over the last thousands of years, but maybe more so over the last 20 or 30 years, has just changed completely. So before, in order to get to know you, I had to have tea with you. I had to sit with you and talk with you. I don't need to do that anymore because I can check your social media profiles. I can.
But what if I'm a different person on social media? You would never get the real taste of it.
The truth is that most of us are not who we are on social media. Right?
Or
and we all know this.
Or at tea.
Or at tea, right? But the point is that the way human beings have interacted with each other for millennium has been sitting and talking, the personal-to-personal experience. And now the way that we experience reality is no longer that. And I think it's a profound statement with profound philosophical consequences for that. Because what it essentially means is that the way we function as human beings is changing. And that's a radical idea. And that, to me, that's terrifying. But it's also just the world that we live in.
Okay. And you wanted to respond to?
Oh, no, I mean, I agree that, there are a lot of, tools that are involved, and there's a lot of this, blurry area where people don't know how a story comes together. And I think, I'm not saying that we should for every AI-generated piece of content, we have to say, we used AI to generate this specific word and this specific, I looked up, what is a synonym for this word, I think it's about sort of, because this is still a new area for us, so it's like for journalists and for media, so I think it's about, working it out as we sort of go along. And I think, we will eventually reach a stage where it's like that, where we don't have to say, oh, we used AI for this specific part. I think, and then, this whole new world that we are sort of, you're talking about, I think, yes, there are a lot of, people who don't have the same ethical standards as, certain journalists, but I think that's where, journalists sort of come in, right? That's what we're trying to do at Almost, which is my media outlet. We are trying to, help, people to parse through this information, to develop that media literacy, to be able to say, oh, this, piece of information is not real because X, Y, Z, so that, young people have these critical thinking skills to be able to make these decisions for themselves.
Okay, good point there. Now, you mentioned personalized, right? Let me pick up on that. So what I am seeing on my feed, what we are seeing on our social media feed is personalized stuff, right? stuff that we want to see, movies that we want to watch. But in many ways, that is narrowing my world outlook, because I'm only seeing stuff that I want to see, while there might be stuff out there that I should see, but I'm not. Can that be somehow solved? Or do you think this is something healthy in the longer run, if that makes sense?
So I'm actually pretty excited about this, because these technologies, the new ones, particularly the generative AI technologies, will lead to personalization, individualization from the person's perspective more than ever. So traditional personalization still comes from somebody who's building this really big algorithm, saying, here are the rules of how to react to things that a user does online, to what other users are doing, in order to create something that feels funneled and personalized to them, but it still comes from a kind of global set of rules. It's not like anybody sits down and goes, right, for you, Jaffer, this is how we're going to make the algorithm, this is what we're going to optimize for, and you get to set everything about it. We don't do that. There's not like a whole engineering team dedicated to you, and a whole engineering team to you, and a whole one for me. With generative tools, now more than ever, there is this possibility that you could actually specify your own rules and have them be implemented. In the same way as with these tools, you can expect things like a video game that is all your own settings that appeal to you. No one has to sit down and write all the storylines out for this video game, which doesn't make much economic sense to produce a whole video game per individual. With generative technology, you could start doing that, where the user is involved. Now, that said, we were having an interesting discussion before we came out with Mohammed about whether in a news setting, whether that control, which we have the potential to give people about what they want in news, like I very much would love to have control over just turning off the ability of news to show me like weird, gruesome, and irrelevant to my decision-making stuff, right? This like, what's it, if it bleeds, it leads, that concept. Like, I would love not to have to see news like that. But how do I tell a system, this is what I want, right? Yeah. We have the potential to start being able to produce news like that. The discussion that we were having is whether people will step up to the kind of responsibility that they would need to take for control of that kind.
Yeah.
Because then that control is a big responsibility.
Here's where I get scared about AI. Like, I've spent a big part of my career going into war zones. It takes a lot to scare me. But here's where I get scared. I think we're living in a world right now where, previously there wasn't enough information. We didn't know what was happening around the world. Now we have the opposite problem where there's too much information. And so what we do is we rely on journalists or websites or your favorite blogger or whatever to take all this complicated stuff that's going around you and simplify it into a way that I understand. So here are two facts that I'm going to present. They're both equally true. Recently, the President of the United States passed some law or something that forgave a limited amount of student debt. I'm Canadian. We think that's usually a pretty good thing, right? We're very kind of that way. Mm-hmm. But he did. Now, here's another fact. The President of the United States is also 80 years old and has fallen down multiple times in public. Both are true. Now, depending on where you are on the political spectrum, one fact will matter much more important, will have much more weight to you than the other. So if you don't like the president, the first thing that you'll think of is, this guy's 80 years old, he's too old, I don't like his policies, and he's not healthy, and he keeps falling down. But if you like the president, you're gonna say, wow, he just saved students hundreds of thousands of dollars on their tuition. Now, both are true. Now, the job of a journalist, as much as it's the most difficult job in the world on the editorial side, is we have to say which fact is more important. And the way that articles used to be written, when they had the old printing press, it would stamp a newspaper, it was called the inverted pyramid. And that's why the first paragraph of a story is the most important. And you know why? Because they had limited amount of paper that they could print on. And so they stamped on the plates all the text, but if it ran too long, they would just rip off the plate and keep the first half. It was called inverted pyramid, and journalists still think that today. So what's the most important thing? Give it to them off the top, and the details we'll sort of leave at the end of the story. But those details now are no longer hidden. Those details are now open to everybody. And depending on what your background is, what your beliefs are, your religion, your ideology, all of those things, you're going to say, hey, wait a minute. You buried that at the bottom of the story, or you didn't even include that in the story. Why would you do that? Because to me, that was the most important part of the story. And this is where I worry, because I don't know how AI solves this problem other than potentially exacerbating those divisions that already exist. Because you'll have one AI model that feeds people one perspective of the world, and you'll have another AI model that feeds people a different perspective, and people will just subscribe to whatever model they feel fits their worldview. And so rather than bringing people together, which hopefully journalism still tries to do, you're gonna have systems that use technology that actually bring people further apart, and that's where I get worried.
Okay, well, see, I'm not a scientist. Perhaps I can ask you, can't we have just one unique model of AI?
Of AI or an AI model?
An AI.
So in this particular circumstance, I'm hearing you, but I'm thinking at the same time, I could, as a user, if I wanted to abdicate my responsibility and I don't want to actually specify precisely how I want my news for decision-making, nothing robs me of being able to say, hey, there's this one journalist I trust, and there's this other journalist I trust. If it's blessed by them, then I want it, otherwise I don't.
Yeah. And I think
Okay,
that's
that
the
makes sense,
answer.
yeah.
That's part of the answer is we used to trust news organizations. And I think that's been eroded a lot. Rightly or wrongly, it's been eroded a lot. And so now the trust is shifting more towards individuals. And if you look at the statistics, most young people today, their first source of news is their favorite YouTube creator or influencer. They're not going to the New York Times, they're not going to the BBC, they're going to somebody that they get makeup tutorials from or something on YouTube to tell them about the world. And I think that will continue. And people will just transfer their trust from big brands to individual people and say, well, I trust this person. You know, I trust Cassie because I've seen her stories and I've seen her content and I think it's really valuable and I feel comfortable with her. And so the relationship will change to a more personal level.
Okay.
And it'll even change towards AI because as, you know, we talk about open AI, but the reality is they're just the first. There are going to be other models that are trained that will come up and spring up, and maybe they'll be trained on different data sets and they'll give you different outputs. And people will just say, well, you know what? I trust AI, or I trust whatever the next AI thing is,
Okay.
that people will trust in different ways.
Interesting point. So, Cassie, if trust in news organizations is going down, do you see a possible way where AI can be used to reinforce or perhaps increase that trust?
Yeah, I mean, I think AI has the potential and the power to be able to help us to, you know, solve a lot of these problems. And I think like journalists could totally be really involved in this process because we have, you know, when we're talking about AI, you know, we have to be conscious that AI itself is built on data that is potentially has biases itself as well. I think there's like this viral thread where someone asked ChatGPT, they were like, name 10 philosophers, and then they were all men, and so they were like, why are there no women? And then they were like, oh, I'm sorry, here is, you know, 10 women philosophers. Why are there no non-Western philosophers? And so I think it's really important that we pay attention to these biases that exist not only in ourselves, but also in AI. And then sort of being able to work with, you know, technology companies to be able to build responsible AI systems that will help us to bring, you know, help to bring people closer to the types of content that they love, but, you know, do it in an ethical way where, you know, we don't risk people falling into these echo chambers and filter bubbles where they just get more narrow in terms of their mindsets. And I think, you know, journalism does still have a very important role to play in that, you know, we do have the data, as I was going to say, you know, we have the data, the text-based data that could be used for, you know, creating AI, and we also have the ethical principles, you know, for, you know, producing, you know, ethical and good AI. So I do believe that, you know, journalists have a really important role to sort of play to work with technology companies to make sure that, you know, we can work together to make AI that will recommend things that people will be able to make good decisions from and to sort of help better the world and continue to sort of highlight these like diverse and sort of underrepresented voices so that we counter these, I guess, the echo chambers that could potentially form and counter the biases that already exist.
Okay, so you believe that the outlook of AI going forward is quite positive. Cassie, is that where we're headed?
I have a positive outlook too, but I want to talk about this whole bias thing, because I heard you say possibly might have bias. Let me just cut right to it. A neat trick, if you ever want to see if somebody really has worked in data for a long time or if they're a total poser, is that people who have worked in data do not pronounce it like it has a capital D. It's not magic that's objective and has got mathematics in it.
Okay.
Data is collected by people. Think of this as a bunch of textbooks. Textbooks could have all kinds of authors. They could have terrible, bigoted authors. They could have incompetent authors. You used to have people thinking just because it made it into a book, it had to be true because there were so few books and it was so curated. And then when anybody could get anything published, all of a sudden we laugh. Oh, you know, it's written in a book, it must be true. Tee hee ha ha, what kind of idiot would think that? Well, similarly, people who work in data have that approach to data. Oh, it's in the data, it must be true. No, how silly, it's exactly the same thing. All kinds of stuff is in data. And the way, a nice mental model to have for data is it's stuff that people thought was a good idea to collect. Like a big storage locker full of stuff, or a museum full of stuff, maybe with some curation. We never go in to look at the objects in a storage locker or in a museum thinking this is free of humans, this is free of human judgment, this is free of the cultural norms of the time that these objects come from. Well, similarly, data will be reflecting very much our values, our time, and yes, one of the wonderful things about data is that it lets us learn from our past. One of the terrible things about data is that it keeps us stuck in our past. Because if our culture and values change, then we'll keep reinforcing, if we're using that data to automate into the future, we'll keep reusing lessons that we wish we had thrown away. So I'm very positive about how much better the world could be when we're able to automate using patterns in data. We already are. There's so many great things that come out of that. There's so many, diseases as yet uncured. There's so many inefficiencies as yet unsolved. But any idea about data as this objective, magical thing that just, is better than us somehow is some nonsense.
Okay.
This is our collection of storage locker of stuff that may or may not be useful.
Okay, let me actually ask the audience. Raise your hands if you think AI is going to take over the human race. Well, not many. So the majority. Okay, well, they're quite a. How would you respond to that?
I'm half, but here's what gives me hope. I think a large part of the world comes from a background where you believe that you're more than just your mind, that you have a soul. And a lot of people here in this audience would probably believe the same thing, that there's something inside of human beings where you have a soul. And that soul has the innate ability or gift or blessing, whatever you call it, to distinguish right from wrong. And I think the danger is in outsourcing that fundamental human thing of what's right and what's wrong, what's real and what's not, to some sort of technology. That's very dangerous. But as long as human beings keep being human beings and understand that we have an ability to discern what's right and what's wrong, and we make those decisions ourselves, and we just don't let technology models make decisions for us, then I think we're fine.
All right.
I have
Sure.
to jump in. I really must. If there is something that I believe is quite a big danger socially of these technologies, it's that we have permitted ourselves to be taken in by science fiction. This needs to end. AI, stop letting it stand for artificial intelligence like robots and all that. Think of it as augmented individuals or automated inspiration, some other thing that reminds us that what we are actually doing here is we are getting tasks automated by using patterns in data. This means that somebody at the start of this process, some leader, says it's a good idea to get that thing automated in that way, and here's the textbook data set that you should learn from. Those are all completely subjective decisions, and we should stop allowing this technology to be faceless by saying, oh, it's some mathematics, it's some robots, it's free of humans, and start seeing that there are some people on the other end who said, optimize this objective, on that data set, go. Because those are the two lines that any AI system boils down into. All that code you used to write to get a task automated, now it's just, what's your objective, what's your data set, okay, go. So, when you say a system or technology makes decisions for you, you should instead say, some people who may or may not have given it adequate thought allowed their decision-making for your process to be automated this way. Is that a good idea? Sometimes. sometimes no.
All right, I would have to give you the last word here because unfortunately we are out of time. Cassie, Mohammed, thank you very much. And more importantly, thanks to you guys for being here with us today.